Well, welcome back to Essentials. If the prophet Samuel had still been around to comment on the goings-on reported in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, he would have said, "I told you so. I told you that kings take. They take what they want, whether it is your land or your daughters or your young men." Reading through 2 Samuel thus far, we may have been tempted to feel that with the death of Saul and the rise of David, who was a man after God's own heart, Israel was safe from a grasping, opportunistic ruler. But in chapter 11, we see the great undoing of David. He was supposed to be the one who was faithful to God, loyal to the Torah. And yet, at the end of this chapter, David will comment to Joab, the thug who did his dirty work, "Do not feel guilty about the death of Uriah, because it is the way of war." It shows the moral disintegration of David in this moment. It is a very cynical statement because while indeed the Torah did not condemn killing that was necessitated in battle, David knew that Uriah's death was unnecessary. It was his own cunning plot to cover up his infidelity and the rape of Bathsheba. The killing that David sloughs off as acceptable, however, God pronounces as evil. The thing was evil in the eyes of Yahweh.
Now, before we look closely at this masterfully narrated chapter, it's important to recall all that is riding on David's kingship. We remember that being king was not just an administrative position in Israel, it was a representative position. And so David's personal life, his moral integrity, all of his character mattered because he represented all of Israel before God. And remember that in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God made this incredible promise to David. He said, "Your house and your kingdom will remain forever before me." God makes this everlasting pledge of covenantal faithfulness to the line of David. And we find out later it ends up being a very costly promise for God to make.
Because he commits to working through the flawed kings instead of just discarding the whole institution and starting again. It reminds me of when I was a portrait painter, and at a certain point, if the likeness wasn't there, I was just hugely relieved to remember that there was a dumpster in the back of the building. But God vows not to use the dumpster. He promises to work through the line of David. The gospel writers will go to great pains to establish that Jesus is of the house and lineage of David.
Now, as we move into the narrative itself, we see that chapter 11 begins with a battle against the Ammonites. And in the ancient Near East, war would cease during the winter months, and then it would begin again in the spring. And so the new Ammonite king had disgraced all of David's people by cutting off the beards of his diplomatic delegation. And so they thought rightly, this taunt needs to be dealt with. So Joab, the leader of David's people, they march off into battle. But David remains comfortably at home on his sofa. Now, if we can imagine all of this, the palace would have been high up on the hillside in Jerusalem, so he would have had a view of all the houses below. Additionally, it wouldn't have been uncommon or unusual for people to bathe on their rooftops. And so as he looks out and he sees Bathsheba bathing on the rooftop, she is doing nothing abnormal or certainly not doing anything wrong. Thus, we see that it's not something about Bathsheba's immodesty that's the problem here. It is rather David's lust. As we move into the whole sequence of this moral failure, the narrator is so terse with what follows. It's the exact opposite of what you might find in a romance novel. David asks other people for her name, and he is told that she's the wife of one of his soldiers. And without even hesitating, David sent, it says. He lay with Bathsheba.
And then Bathsheba gets her 3 verbs. She returned, she conceived, and then she sent word to David, "I am pregnant." there's another detail, which is that she had purified herself after her period, which meant that she could not have been pregnant before she was commanded to have sex with the king. David's sin is very grave. His behavior has been the opposite of hesed, that covenant faithfulness that God had demonstrated towards him and towards Israel as a whole. But David's power as king to take and use has been stymied by the power of Bathsheba to conceive.
Now, this is just the beginning of David's realization that he is absolutely not in control, because he comes up against Uriah the Hittite, the faithful husband and soldier who absolutely refuses to take his ease and lie with his wife while his men are at war. See, Uriah, he isn't even an Israelite. He's a Hittite. And yet he shows more understanding of God's instructions and more concern for David's own men than David does. And just an interesting note here, David's attempt to induce Uriah to go down to Bathsheba with gifts and food and conversation and intoxication are much more extended than the scene with Bathsheba itself. And this goes just to point out the great contrast between Uriah's steadfast integrity and David's malicious selfishness.
When David realizes that Uriah will not comply, he plots a murder disguised as a casualty of war. Once again, Joab is called in for the dirty work, and David so trusts Uriah's integrity that he sends the written order in his hand. Uriah is placed where the fighting is fiercest, and he is left vulnerable and abandoned. It is accomplished. The news is brought back, and David makes his comment to Joab, "Don't let this matter trouble you." And the narrator tells us that this matter displeased Yahweh. This dreadful series of actions has consequences for David, for Bathsheba, and for Israel. But God does not abandon David or Bathsheba or Israel. He sends the prophet Nathan with a word of truth and hope. I wonder if you have ever experienced a time when your own moral failing was answered, surprisingly, by a word of truth and hope. I want to read to you from the first letter of John regarding this and the promises we have in the New Testament. This is verse 8. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, he who is faithful and just will forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. My little children, I am writing these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous.